You have been told bronze is a modest metal, a stepping stone between the Stone Age and something better. Here is what actually happened in a flooded casting pit in Moscow on a May night in 1737, while much of the city burned around it. The pit sat beneath a wooden shelter near the Kremlin wall. Inside it, half buried in earth and clay, lay 200 tons of bronze, still warm from its casting 2 years before, waiting to be finished. Smoke rolled low across the ground that night, thick and oily, carrying the smell of burning pine and tar from roofs collapsing 3 streets away. Sparks landed on the shelter's roof one by one, then all at once. The workers who ran to save it did not think about metallurgy. They thought about fire reaching 200 tons of unfinished treasure that had already cost a fortune and 8 years of failed attempts, so they did the only thing that made sense in the moment. They threw water on it. Cold water on a mass of bronze, still holding the memory of furnace heat, does not cool a metal gently. It shocks it. Somewhere beneath the surface, crystal structures that had settled slowly over 2 years tore apart in seconds. Witnesses later described a sound like a cannon firing from underground. An 11.5-ton piece sheared cleanly off the side and dropped into the mud. That fragment came from what would become known as the Tsar bell, the largest bell ever cast by human hands, and it has never rung, not once, not for a single second, in almost 300 years. To understand why a piece of metal that big, that expensive, that important, ended up cracked and mute in a hole in the ground, we don't need to go back 3 days. We need to go back roughly 5,000 years, to a much smaller fire, in a much smaller pit, where someone first discovered that 2 soft, unremarkable metals could be combined into something neither one of them was alone. Picture a smithy in Mesopotamia, somewhere near the Tigris, sometime around 3500 BCE. The air smells of charcoal and wet clay. A craftsman is melting copper, a metal already familiar, already useful, already soft enough to bend with a strong thumb. On this particular day, whether by accident or by an early experiment we will never fully reconstruct, tin ore finds its way into the mix. What comes out of the crucible afterward is not copper anymore. It is harder, it holds an edge, it flows into a mold more evenly, and it rings when struck instead of thudding. Historians still debate exactly where this happened first. Sites in the Near East, in the Balkans, and later in China and the Andes all show tin bronze appearing independently, without contact between these regions, which is itself one of the stranger facts about this metal. Nobody handed anyone the recipe. Several different peoples, thousands of miles apart, separately discovered that combining copper and tin in roughly the right ratio, somewhere around 8 or 9 parts, copper to 1 part tin, produces an alloy that neither metal can produce on its own. That single discovery reorganized the ancient world within a few centuries, because copper and tin are almost never found together. Copper deposits cluster in places like Cyprus, and tin deposits cluster in far more scattered locations, including, remarkably, the coast of Cornwall in what is now southwest England and mountain ranges in what is now Afghanistan. To make bronze reliably, someone had to move one of these metals hundreds or thousands of miles to meet the other. So trade routes formed that had no reason to exist otherwise. Ships crossed open Mediterranean water carrying ingots shaped like animal hides, so heavy that a wrecked cargo of them found off the coast of Turkey near a headland called Uluburun and dated to roughly 1300 BCE still held roughly 10 tons of copper and about a ton of tin when archaeologists raised it in the 1980s. Picture the creak of rope under that weight, salt spray on wooden hulls, sailors gambling weeks of their lives on cargo that would arm someone else's army on the far side of the sea. By the time this trade matured, entire civilizations depended on it, the way modern nations depend on oil. Mycenaean warriors in Greece wore bronze armor plates. Hittite chariots in Anatolia rolled on fittings cast from it. Egyptian workshops turned it into tools that built temples along the Nile. None of these societies could make a sword, a plow blade, or a temple door hinge without a functioning supply chain stretching across a sea and sometimes across a continent. Here's the question worth sitting with for a moment. What happens to a network of civilizations when the thing holding them together isn't a shared language or a shared god, but a shared dependency on 2 metals that have to travel enormous distances to meet each other? Historians have an answer, and it arrived with the sound of grinding hulls on beaches and cities burning in a single terrible century. Around 1177 BCE, a date the historian Eric Klein uses as shorthand for a broader collapse rather than a single day, the interconnected Bronze Age world came apart with startling speed. Clay tablets from the city of Ugarit on the Syrian coast record the king writing increasingly desperate letters as enemy ships appeared offshore, pleading for aid that never came. Within a generation, the Hittite capital of Hattusa lay abandoned. Mycenaean palaces in Greece burned, and cities across the eastern Mediterranean went dark, some never reoccupied. Historians still argue over exactly what triggered it, whether it was the raiders later texts call the Sea Peoples, whether it was drought, whether it was a chain of earthquakes, or whether it was the simple fragility of a trade system where cutting one link, the tin route through Anatolia or the copper route through Cyprus, could starve dozens of kingdoms of the one alloy their weapons, tools, and status depended on. What almost everyone agrees on is the pattern. These weren't isolated collapses. They happened together, fast, across a network bound by bronze. And yet the metal itself did not disappear. It simply changed hands, changed shapes, and kept its hold on power in quieter ways. In China, centuries earlier and continuing long after, Shang and Zhou dynasty foundries cast enormous ritual vessels called ding, some weighing hundreds of kilograms, using clay piece molds so precise that the casting itself became a form of political theater. Picture the smell of burning straw and clay dust as workers broke open a mold to reveal a vessel meant to speak to ancestors on behalf of a king, its surface covered in patterns no one alive today can fully read the meaning of. Around 280 BCE, on the Greek island of Rhodes, a sculptor named Shares of Lindos finished a bronze statue standing roughly 33 meters tall, built to celebrate the successful year-long defense of Rhodes against Demetrius Poliorcetes, funded in part by melting down siege equipment the retreating army left behind. The Colossus of Rhodes stood for about 54 years before an earthquake in 226 BCE snapped it at the knees. Its bronze plates, according to Pliny the Elder writing centuries later, lay on the ground for another 800 years, visited by travelers who reportedly could not wrap their arms around a single finger. What happened to those plates afterward is genuinely disputed. Later writers claimed the fragments were eventually sold and melted down, some accounts even naming a merchant who supposedly carted the metal away on hundreds of camels. But that specific story is legend, unverifiable, and historians treat it as folklore rather than record. What we do know for certain is that bronze, unlike stone, rarely stays what it was. It gets melted, recast, and reborn as something else entirely, over and over, which means the atoms in an ancient god's face might have ended up as a coin, or a tool, or eventually a gun. That recyclability made bronze the metal of choice for something far more dangerous than statues. As gunpowder weapons spread through Europe in the late medieval period, founders discovered that bell casting techniques, already refined over centuries, transferred almost perfectly to casting cannon. The same furnaces, the same molds, the same craftsmen. But a flaw invisible during casting, a hidden air pocket or an impurity in the mix, could turn a cannon into a bomb aimed at the men loading it. In 1460, King James II of Scotland stood near one of his own bombards, nicknamed the Lion, at the siege of Roxburgh Castle, celebrating what looked like an imminent victory. The cannon burst as it fired. Contemporary chronicles record that the king died from the blast, killed by his own artillery, a detail that made bronze cannon founding, for the next several centuries, one of the most respected and most feared crafts in Europe. Founders who got the ratio even slightly wrong didn't just waste metal, they killed people. It's worth pausing here on something that sounds almost too simple to matter, but changes how you should think about everything said so far. Bronze does not exist in nature, not anywhere. You cannot dig a hole and find a vein of it the way you find gold or iron ore or silver. Every single piece of bronze that has ever existed, from a Mesopotamian axe head to the Colossus of Rhodes to the cannon that killed a Scottish king, was deliberately made by a human being who combined two different metals in something close to the right proportion, using fire hot enough to melt both. That means every empire we've mentioned, every collapse, every statue, every war fought with bronze weapons, was built not on a natural resource pulled from the ground, but on a formula, a recipe. Something closer to a technology than a discovery, and something that, like any valuable formula, could be hoarded, guarded, and passed down as a family secret rather than shared openly. Which brings us back to the pit in Moscow, and to a family of bell founders named Motorin. Empress Anna Ivanovna commissioned the Great Bell in the early 1730s, intending to outdo an earlier Russian bell that had already cracked in an earlier fire decades before. The task fell to a father and son team, Ivan and Mikhail Motorin, master founders who guarded their bell-bronze ratio, roughly 80 parts copper to 20 parts tin with small additions of gold and silver according to surviving records, the way a chemist guards a formula. Casting began in November 1735, and after multiple furnace failures, including one fire that destroyed the original wooden structure above the pit, the pour finally succeeded. The result weighed close to 202 tons, a figure so large that no bell before or since has matched it. This same instinct to guard an alloy recipe like a family inheritance shows up again almost a century earlier and thousands of miles away in Constantinople. Company tradition holds that in 1623, an Armenian metalworker named Avadis discovered a specific bronze alloy, still roughly 80% copper and 20% tin with trace elements, that produced cymbals with a uniquely warm, complex sound when struck. He took the name Zildjian, meaning cymbal maker, and the exact formula has been passed down through the family for nearly 4 centuries, still guarded today by the company that bears his name. The same alloy that once killed a king when it failed in a cannon barrel is, in a slightly different ratio, the reason a cymbal on a modern drum kit sounds the way it does. So when the fire of 1737 swept toward the unfinished Tsar bell, still sitting in its casting pit, still needing to be extracted and hung, the workers who threw water on it weren't just trying to save a bell. They were trying to protect a formula made physical, a piece of guarded knowledge frozen into 200 tons of metal, and their panic cracked it before it ever spoke. The bell sat exactly where it fell for almost 100 years. No one had the engineering or the will to move something that heavy, sitting at the bottom of a pit, broken, useless as a bell, but too significant to melt down and forget. It became a strange kind of monument to failure, visited by curious travelers who peered down into the hole and wondered what all that potential energy, all that sound it would never make, actually meant. In 1836, the French-born architect Auguste de Montferrand, already known in Russia for his work on St. Isaac's Cathedral, engineered a system to finally raise the bell out of the pit using a network of wooden supports and pulleys. Picture the moment the bell first cleared ground level after a century underground, mud still clinging to its surface, the crowd silent, waiting for a sound that would never come because the crack had already made ringing impossible. It was placed on a stone pedestal near the Kremlin's Ivan the Great bell tower, where it still sits today. If you visit it now, you can press your palm against bronze that has not felt a hammer in nearly 3 centuries. Tour guides point out the broken fragment resting beside the bell like a tombstone next to the body it came from. Visitors often ask the same question the guides have answered thousands of times. What would it have sounded like? Nobody alive has ever heard it, and nobody ever will, and there is something quietly haunting about a bell that exists purely as the largest silence ever cast in metal. But bronze itself did not stop working just because one bell failed. It kept doing, quietly, almost invisibly, the same job it has done for 5,000 years, which is holding civilization together in places you don't usually look. Ship propellers today are still commonly cast in bronze alloys because salt water corrodes it more slowly than steel, meaning a metal invented before writing itself still spins beneath cargo ships crossing oceans right now. Nobel Prize medals are struck in bronze plated with gold, meaning the highest honor in human achievement is, physically, the same alloy that once armed Bronze Age chariots. Statue foundries around the world today still use lost wax casting techniques that would be recognizable, in their basic steps, to a craftsman working in Shang Dynasty China or ancient Rhodes. Here's why any of this should matter to you, specifically listening to this today, in a world full of synthetic materials and engineered alloys you've never heard of. Every advanced material humans have ever built, from Damascus steel to modern titanium alloys to the lithium compounds inside the battery in your pocket, follows the exact principle that unnamed craftsperson stumbled onto in Mesopotamia 5,000 years ago. Nature rarely hands you the ideal material. Sometimes you have to combine 2 ordinary things, deliberately, through fire, patience, and a formula worth protecting, to make something neither one could be alone. What's easy to forget, standing in front of a museum bell, or reading about a king killed by his own cannon, is that none of this was inevitable. Someone had to notice that tin changed copper. Someone had to risk a fortune moving that tin across a continent to meet copper it would never otherwise touch. Someone had to guard the exact ratio like a life depended on it, because in the case of cannon founders and Scottish kings, it sometimes did. The Tsar bell never rang, and in a strange way that silence says more about bronze than any sound it could have made. A metal invented on purpose, traded across empires that rose and fell together, cast into gods and guns and coins and symbols, still sitting cold and mute in a Kremlin courtyard, still spinning quietly beneath ships crossing oceans tonight, still humming in a slightly different ratio every time a drummer hits a cymbal on a stage somewhere in the world right now. So here is a question worth carrying with you. If a formula that old, that guarded, that dangerous when done wrong, could shape trade routes, topple kings, and outlive the very civilizations that depended on it, what does that tell you about the materials quietly running through your own life today that you've never once stopped to ask where they actually came from? And if you had stood in that pit in Moscow in 1737, watching 2 years of work crack apart in front of you, would you have understood in that moment that you weren't just watching a bell fail? You were watching 5,000 years of human formula, keeping meat fire, water, and panic all at once. Main sources for this story include Eric Klein's research on the late Bronze Age collapse, the historical archives of the Moscow Kremlin museums on the Tsar bell, Pliny the Elder's natural history on the Colossus of Rhodes, and the published archaeological findings on early tin bronze metallurgy in Eurasia. The full list is in the description.